Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. Caroline Pino was a free spirit, a young woman who embraced adventure and sought meaning beyond the confines of conventional life. At 24, she had already experienced a tumultuous upbringing, marked by her parents' separation and struggles with traditional education. Despite these challenges, she found her place in alternative schooling, developing a strong social consciousness and a passion for exploring the world. On July 10, 1996, Caroline embarked on a journey that was meant to be an exciting adventure. Along with her acquaintance Mark, she set out on a hitchhiking trip from Nijmegen, Netherlands to Salto, Portugal. Their destination, the Rainbow Gathering, a festival known for its countercultural community, where people from all walks of life gathered to share peace, music, and self-expression. The journey was unconventional, relying on the kindness of strangers to reach their goal. Caroline and Mark hitched multiple rides, encountering various people along the way, all while embracing the unpredictability of their travels. After 10 days on the road, they finally arrived at the Rainbow Gathering. The festival was everything they had hoped for, filled with vibrant energy, music, and a sense of belonging among like-minded individuals. However, the celebration was short-lived. Caroline had prior commitments. She had promised her family to meet them at a campsite near Paris on July 28. Determined to keep her word, she and Mark set off on their return journey on July 24. The road ahead, however, held unknown dangers that would ultimately change the course of Caroline's life forever. On July 25th, their hitchhiking efforts led them to a ride with a Frenchman driving a white van. The man seemed helpful at first, but tensions rose between Caroline and Mark during the ride. Their disagreement resulted in Caroline making a fateful decision. She would continue the journey alone with the driver, while Mark parted ways, eventually making it back to the Netherlands 2 days later. Caroline's choice to remain with the Frenchman marked the last time she was seen in the presence of someone she knew. From this point forward, Caroline's movements became uncertain. The Frenchman dropped her off in Castet, near a trucker's cafe. What transpired afterward remains shrouded in mystery. The next known record of her existence was on July 26, when she exchanged a traveler's check for 100 Dutch guilders at a money exchange office in Rennes. Rennes was an unusual location for her to be, far from the direct route to Paris. How she got there remains unknown, and this discrepancy would become a crucial missing piece in the puzzle of her disappearance. Caroline never arrived at the Parisian campsite where her family awaited her. Days passed, and concern turned to alarm. Her absence was uncharacteristic. She was known for her sense of responsibility, and her family knew something was terribly wrong. Then, on August 7, 1996, a horrifying discovery was made. A road worker near Orsay, France, stumbled upon a lifeless body beside an on-ramp leading toward Paris. The young woman was partially clothed, lying inside a sleeping bag with her knees drawn up. The victim was Caroline Pino. The news shattered her family and friends, but even more devastating was the revelation that the investigation into her murder would be fraught with complications. The French authorities conducted an initial inquiry, but made critical errors that would hinder justice for years to come. Caroline's body was found to have been strangled, with a fractured rib suggesting she had suffered before her death. However, forensic limitations at the time meant that authorities could not confirm whether she had been sexually assaulted. Despite these findings, no immediate leads surfaced, and the case would soon slip into obscurity, leaving Caroline's loved ones desperate for answers. The story of Caroline Pino is one of heartbreak and unanswered questions. A young woman with a bright future, taken under mysterious and brutal circumstances. This chapter marks the beginning of an exploration into the complexities of her case. Where did she go after leaving Castet? Who did she meet along the way? And most importantly, who was responsible for her untimely death? As we delve deeper into this mystery, we will uncover the details of the flawed investigation, the efforts of her relentless mother to seek justice, and the troubling realities of cross-border crime investigations. The road to the truth is long and uncertain, but the search for justice for Caroline Pino must continue. The morning of July 25, 1996, began as just another leg of an unpredictable adventure for Caroline Pino. The journey, initially shared with Mark, her travel companion, had taken them through a series of rides with strangers, each moment unpredictable and filled with new possibilities. Mark had eventually parted ways with Caroline, leaving her to continue her travels alone. Their plans had split when an argument caused Caroline to decide that she would journey onward without him. Mark, after all, had only been part of her journey for a short while, a companion on the road to the Rainbow Gathering Festival. They were from different backgrounds, but both shared the same sense of wanderlust that brought them together on this hitchhiking trip from Nijmegen to Portugal. It was the kind of adventure that could bond two strangers, but in the end, Caroline's independent spirit led her to make the choice to continue alone. The Frenchman who picked Caroline up that day seemed like a harmless enough figure at first. He was driving a white van, the kind of vehicle one would associate with long-haul drivers, traversing the long distances of the European highways. They exchanged pleasantries, perhaps even a few stories of the road. But as the hours wore on, tensions began to build between the two travelers. Details of the argument that occurred between Caroline and Mark remain unclear, but the fracture was enough to cause Caroline to make a choice that would alter the course of her life forever. It wasn't long after that the Frenchman dropped Caroline off at a trucker's cafe in Castet, a small village nestled in the southern reaches of France. The decision seemed strange, a place far from her intended destination of Paris, and yet there she was, alone on the side of a quiet road, with no clear explanation for what would come next. The journey from Castet to Rennes, where Caroline would later be seen exchanging a traveler's check, was neither direct nor expected. For someone who had been heading toward Paris, Rennes lay in the opposite direction, several hundred kilometers to the northwest. The question loomed large. How did Caroline end up there? Perhaps Caroline had met another stranger on the road, someone who offered her a ride or convinced her to change her direction. This possibility seems likely given that there were few options for public transportation at the time, and Caroline's hitchhiking journey had proven to be one of constant change. As the hours passed, any sense of predictability left her journey behind, replaced instead by uncertainty and risk. Whatever the case, she was in Rennes on July 26, 1996. A traveler's check for 100 Dutch guilders was exchanged, marking the last known financial transaction connected to Caroline. No further details from that day are known. No additional rides, no eyewitness accounts of where she went or who she may have met. In fact, after this exchange, her trail would go cold for several weeks, leading her family, friends, and investigators into the darkest unknowns of the case. Back in the Netherlands, Caroline's mother, Wil Vreeburg, had been eagerly awaiting her daughter's arrival in Paris. The family had planned to meet at a campsite near the French capital on July 28, 1996. Caroline had made arrangements to meet them there, a promise that seemed typical of her responsible nature. Wil, who had grown up with her daughter's defiant spirit and creativity, had no reason to doubt that Caroline would honor her commitment. But as the days passed, Wil's anxiety grew. Caroline did not show up at the campsite, nor did she contact her family to explain the delay. Something was terribly wrong. The days without word turned into weeks, and the absence of any communication raised immediate concern. Wil contacted the authorities, but initially, the response from the police was frustratingly slow. Investigations into Caroline's whereabouts did not seem to take the urgency they deserved. As time passed, her mother's desperation grew, but no concrete leads emerged. Despite the mounting pressure from the family, who were adamant that something was amiss, the authorities in France were slow to act. It wasn't until August 7, 1996, that the mystery began to unravel, but in the most chilling way imaginable. A road worker near Orsay, a commune located just south of Paris, stumbled upon the body of a young woman beside an on-ramp. The lifeless figure was identified as Caroline Pino. She had been strangled and left in a manner that suggested she had been violently attacked. The shocking discovery left the family in disbelief, unable to fathom the brutal fate that had befallen their daughter. The body had been discarded, discarded with no clear reason. Caroline had been left alone, exposed, and vulnerable, her clothing minimal, and her body cruelly discarded in the manner of a discarded object. The sense of violation was profound, not only for the Pino family, but for anyone who would later hear the details of the case. The circumstances of her death pointed to something much darker than a tragic accident. This was no mere disappearance. It was a murder, and one that would remain unsolved for many years to come. In the days following the discovery, the investigation into Caroline's death revealed key details that would form the foundation for what would become one of the most frustrating cold cases in modern history. But the investigation also revealed something more troubling. The errors, delays, and missteps in the early stages of the case made it more difficult for the authorities to uncover the truth. Important clues were ignored, leads were missed, and the investigation seemed to stumble at every turn. One of the most frustrating elements of the case for Wil Vreeburg was the lack of communication and support from the French authorities. Wil was not kept informed about the progress of the investigation, nor was she provided with clear answers regarding her daughter's death. As the weeks turned into months, the sense of frustration and helplessness became overwhelming. Wil wrote letters, made phone calls, and pleaded with anyone who would listen, but the answers were slow to come. The delays and mishandling of the investigation would haunt her for years, leaving a mother to wrestle with the unimaginable. Despite the immense pressure, no immediate suspects were identified, and the investigation in France seemed to go nowhere. It would take years for any new leads to surface, but even when they did, they were often overshadowed by the passage of time and the limitations of forensic technology available at the time. This chapter in Caroline's story reflects the mystery that surrounded her final days. The vanishing trail that began with her leaving Castet on July 25th remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. Who did she encounter along the way? Did she make any attempts to contact her family or anyone who could have helped her? What was her true fate during those final days, between Rennes and her death in Orsay? The answers remain elusive, but the search for the truth continues. As we move forward in this case, we will continue to piece together the puzzle that remains unsolved. The haunting question lingers. Who was responsible for Caroline Pino's death, and why was she left to die alone, discarded at the side of a road in France? The discovery of Caroline Pino's body on August 7, 1996, sent shockwaves through her family, her friends, and the wider community. The violent nature of her death was alarming, and the sheer brutality of the act left many wondering. Who could have done this? And why? As the investigation began, however, it became clear that this would not be a straightforward case. The lack of leads, coupled with errors made by the authorities, would cause frustration for years to come. It was only the relentless persistence of Caroline's mother, Wil Vreeburg, that kept the case alive. Immediately after the discovery of Caroline's body, the French authorities were called to the scene. The initial investigation revealed little more than the obvious. Caroline had been strangled and left in a vulnerable, discarded manner. Her body was found in a sleep sack, with her knees pulled up to her chest. It was a clear sign that whoever had killed her had not just been indifferent to her life, but had shown an utter disregard for her dignity in death. The French police's initial response, however, was less than reassuring. The area where Caroline's body had been found was not a typical crime scene. It was a remote spot, far from the bustle of city life, making it difficult for investigators to find any immediate suspects or witnesses. At first glance, it seemed like just another tragic death, a random act of violence in an already dangerous world. But Caroline was not just another victim. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, and someone whose life mattered. The first crucial mistake came with the delay in identifying Caroline. Her body had been found on August 7th, but it took several weeks for the authorities to positively identify her. This delay not only caused more pain for her family, who were waiting desperately for answers, but also allowed the case to go cold in its earliest stages. In the first few weeks after Caroline's death, the investigation struggled to gain traction. The police were unable to track down any solid leads or potential suspects, despite the fact that Caroline's disappearance had been reported nearly 2 weeks earlier. The lack of a suspect in the case made it all the more difficult to piece together the events leading up to Caroline's murder. There were, however, a few potential pieces of evidence. The location where her body had been discovered suggested that she had been left in a hurry, with no attempt to conceal her remains. The fact that she had been strangled pointed to someone with a significant amount of personal animosity or anger toward her. But there were no fingerprints, no forensic evidence, and no clear connections to any known criminals. In the absence of such evidence, the investigation into Caroline's death remained stalled. While the French investigation struggled, Caroline's mother, Wil Vreeburg, refused to give up. The heartbreak of losing her daughter was compounded by the frustration of not knowing what had happened, or why Caroline had ended up in such a tragic situation. From the very beginning, Wil felt that the case was not being taken seriously enough by the authorities, and she made it her mission to push for answers, no matter how long it took. Wil's first challenge was the communication gap between the French authorities and the Dutch government. She quickly discovered that there was little cooperation between the two nations, despite the fact that Caroline was a Dutch citizen. Wil was forced to take matters into her own hands, writing letters to politicians, appealing to anyone who might be able to offer assistance. Her goal was simple: to keep Caroline's case alive and to ensure that the investigation did not fall by the wayside. In 1997, Wil sent a letter to the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs, urging the government to intervene in the case. She received a reply stating that the Dutch government could not directly interfere with the investigation in France, but that they would offer assistance where possible. It was a response that Wil felt was insufficient. She continued to write letters, calling for more attention to be paid to her daughter's case. But Wil's persistence didn't stop there. In 1997, the renowned Dutch investigative journalist Peter R. de Vries began covering Caroline's case in his television program. The media exposure helped bring more attention to the unsolved murder, but it also led to more questions than answers. Despite the widespread coverage, there were still no significant breakthroughs in the investigation. The years passed, and for a time, it seemed as though Caroline's case had been forgotten. But in 2017, more than 2 decades after her death, the Dutch cold case team, operating out of the eastern Netherlands, decided to take another look at the case. They reached out to the French authorities, who, after some negotiation, agreed to release the full case file to the Dutch team. This was a crucial step in reigniting the investigation, but it also highlighted just how much time had passed since Caroline's death. The cold case team began reviewing the evidence, including photographs of the crime scene and the forensic reports. While much of the evidence from 1996 had been lost or degraded, there were still some key pieces that might help solve the mystery. For instance, the sleep sack Caroline had been found and was examined again, and DNA samples were taken. These samples were submitted to an international DNA database in hopes of finding a match to any known criminals. In addition to the DNA evidence, the cold case team also focused on revisiting the original timeline of events leading up to Caroline's death. They re-examined her interactions with Mark, the Frenchman who had given her a ride, and the other individuals who may have crossed her path during her travels. Each new lead was carefully explored, but the passage of time had made it more difficult to find any concrete connections. Despite the challenges, the revival of the case brought a sense of hope to Wil Vreeburg. The prospect of new breakthroughs, even after so many years, kept her going. She continued to fight for justice for her daughter, even as the years seemed to slip away. In 2018, the French authorities, now working with the Dutch cold case team, began to investigate new leads. A man, who had been known to frequent the Truckers' Cafe in Castet, was identified as a possible suspect. He had been in the area around the time Caroline was dropped off, and there were reports that he had been acting suspiciously. The investigation into this man led to further interviews with individuals who had been in the area at the time, but no solid evidence ever materialized to link him directly to Caroline's murder. Nonetheless, the theory that Caroline's killer was someone she encountered during her travels was becoming more likely. There were simply too many unknowns for the investigation to draw any definitive conclusions. Wil, ever hopeful, remained determined to see her daughter's case through to the end. The lack of a clear suspect did not deter her, rather, it strengthened her resolve. She knew that, no matter how many years it took, she would continue fighting for justice for Caroline. The search for answers was far from over. As time passed, the French investigation remained stalled, Yet there were still elements of the case that required closer scrutiny. The key pieces of evidence, such as the sleep sack, DNA samples, and the last known location of Caroline, near Rennes and Castet, remained focal points for the investigators. One of the challenges they faced was reconstructing Caroline's movements after she had been dropped off at the trucker's cafe. The route to Rennes, where she had cashed a check, was not on the direct path to Paris, raising more questions about her journey. How had she gotten from Castet to Rennes? And who else could have crossed her path? With no solid leads, the team turned to forensics. The evidence collected in 1996, including Caroline's clothing and the items found around her body, was re-examined. This was a slow, painstaking process. The forensic team began by analyzing the fabric of the sleep sack. Was there any DNA from other individuals? They also performed detailed tests on the fibers found on her clothing, hoping to uncover traces of someone who might have been involved in the crime. But each test came back inconclusive. Without a direct DNA match to a suspect, investigators struggled to piece together the final moments of Caroline's life. It wasn't just forensics that would help, however. Witness testimonies were another area the investigators hoped to explore. With her disappearance occurring in France, along the border regions near Spain and Portugal, it was possible that someone had seen Caroline in the days leading up to her death. Witnesses could provide the crucial piece of the puzzle, but finding them after so many years was an increasingly difficult task. In the midst of the investigations and years of uncertainty, the emotional toll on Caroline's family, particularly her mother Wil, was immense. From the moment she learned of Caroline's murder, Wil never stopped searching for answers. Even when hope seemed bleak, she found strength in the belief that someone, somewhere, knew something that could lead to justice for her daughter. Wil's persistence was remarkable. She constantly wrote letters, made phone calls, and even took trips to France in search of answers. Her determination brought her into contact with journalists, police officials, and investigators, but it also left her feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. There were times when the lack of progress made it feel like Caroline's case would be lost to history. But Wil never let go of the hope that one day, the truth would be uncovered. In the years following Caroline's death, Wil wrote a book titled Caroline to share the story of her daughter's life and the ongoing fight for justice. In the book, Wil chronicled Caroline's life before her death, including her creative, free-spirited nature and her struggles with personal relationships. The book also highlighted the flaws in the investigation and the ongoing pain of not knowing why her daughter had been murdered. Through all the frustration and heartache, Wil's advocacy for her daughter never waned. She continued to speak out about the shortcomings of the investigation, especially the lack of communication between the French and Dutch authorities. For years, Wil fought for her daughter's case to be treated with the seriousness it deserved. One of the most significant barriers that Wil faced was the lack of cooperation between the French and Dutch authorities. As the investigation spanned two countries, it became clear that the bureaucratic red tape and jurisdictional boundaries were hindering progress. The French police were in charge of the investigation since the crime occurred on their soil, but Wil, living in the Netherlands, struggled to have her voice heard. In 1997, Wil reached out to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, hoping to gain support for the investigation. Her letter was met with a response that echoed the frustrating reality of international criminal investigations. The Dutch government stated that they could not intervene directly in the French investigation, as it was outside their jurisdiction. The response was a blow to Wil, who had hoped for more support from her own government. Despite this setback, Wil was not deterred. She continued to push for the case to remain active, writing letters to politicians, speaking with journalists, and reaching out to various authorities. Her resolve was unwavering, and she was determined to find out what had happened to her daughter. One of the critical turning points in Caroline's case came when the Dutch journalist Peter R. de Vries took an interest in the case. Known for his work on unsolved crimes, de Vries dedicated several episodes of his program to Caroline's murder. His high-profile coverage brought the case into the public eye once again, generating new leads and offering Wil the opportunity to speak directly to a wider audience. The media coverage not only kept the case alive, but also helped to generate fresh tips and witness statements. People who had been hesitant to come forward earlier, perhaps out of fear or uncertainty, now felt emboldened to share what they knew. But unfortunately, these new leads did not immediately solve the case. Some witnesses who came forward could not offer substantial evidence, while others provided conflicting accounts. Still, the media attention had its advantages. The renewed public interest in the case meant that the authorities could not simply let the investigation slip into obscurity. As a result, they were forced to continue their work, even if progress was slow. After years of stalled investigations, the Dutch cold case team took a renewed interest in Caroline's case in 2017. This was a major turning point for the investigation, as the Dutch authorities reached out to their French counterparts to obtain the full case file. It was a significant moment because it marked the first time in over 2 decades that the case was thoroughly reviewed by a new group of investigators. The cold case team had access to new technology and forensic techniques that had not been available in 1996. DNA testing had advanced significantly, and investigators hoped that the new methods could provide the breakthrough they so desperately needed. They also revisited old leads and re-examined the key pieces of evidence that had been collected all those years ago. The renewed investigation provided Wil with a glimmer of hope, though she was fully aware that the passage of time had made it more difficult to solve the case. By 2018, the French authorities and the Dutch cold case team had narrowed down a few potential suspects. One such individual was a man who had been seen near the Truckers' Cafe in Castet around the time Caroline was dropped off. This man was known to frequent the area, and his behavior had been described as suspicious. He was interrogated, but there was insufficient evidence to link him directly to Caroline's murder. Despite this, investigators continued to explore every possible lead, knowing that a breakthrough could be just around the corner. Wil, meanwhile, continued her tireless advocacy, never losing sight of the ultimate goal: justice for Caroline. In 2017, the French police, under pressure from the Dutch cold case team, agreed to reopen Caroline's case. This decision was a long-awaited one, as both Caroline's family and the public had questioned why the investigation had stalled for so many years. Wil Vreeburg, Caroline's mother, had been relentless in her pursuit of justice, refusing to let her daughter's case be forgotten. Her tireless advocacy paid off when the cold case team in the Netherlands made contact with the French authorities, urging them to take a fresh look at the case. The cold case team's involvement marked a significant turning point. The team, which had worked on numerous unsolved cases, had access to modern investigative methods and new technologies that had not been available during the original investigation. In particular, advancements in forensic science offered a glimmer of hope. DNA analysis had come a long way in 20 years, and the hope was that re-examining the evidence with these new techniques could provide a breakthrough. Forensic experts revisited the DNA samples collected from Caroline's belongings, including traces of fibers and hair found on her clothes and the sleep sack she was found in. The sleep sack, in particular, had been a critical piece of evidence. It had been with Caroline when her body was discovered, and investigators knew it could hold vital clues. If any foreign DNA was present, it could link a suspect to the crime. Additionally, the team revisited the clothing Caroline had been wearing, her jeans, t-shirt, and the distinctive boots that were found near her body. Were there any unusual fibers or other materials that could suggest she had encountered someone during her travels? Could they trace the exact route she took after leaving the Truckers' Cafe in Castet? All these questions were now being addressed with renewed urgency. The Dutch cold case team quickly began working alongside their French counterparts, reviewing the evidence and cross-referencing it with new DNA databases. They also examined the police reports from 1996, looking for any overlooked leads. Investigators hoped to identify potential suspects or witnesses that could provide valuable information. However, as in most cold cases, the biggest challenge was time. The physical evidence had deteriorated, and many of the witnesses who could have provided valuable testimony had long since moved on with their lives, unaware that their small piece of information could make a difference. As the investigation progressed, the authorities became more focused on the timeline of Caroline's final days. On July 25, 1996, she had parted ways with Mark, deciding to continue her journey alone with the French man who had offered her a ride. But what had happened after she was dropped off at the Truckers' Cafe in Castet? The distance between Castet and Rennes where Caroline had cashed the check, was significant, and investigators still struggled to find a clear explanation for how she had traveled between these 2 points. Did she hitchhike? Did she accept another ride? Or was there another, more sinister explanation? The police also revisited the site where Caroline's body was found in Orsay, a small commune in the Essonne department near Paris. It had been almost 2 weeks since her death when her body was discovered by a road worker. The location itself raised questions. Why had Caroline been left in such a remote area? It seemed odd that someone would just abandon her body, so far from the known routes to Paris. Investigators speculated that Caroline's killer may have had knowledge of the area, possibly someone familiar with the roads in that region. The theory that Caroline's killer had dumped her body in a place that felt safe to them was discussed extensively by the French authorities. One of the key breakthroughs came from the forensic re-examination of Caroline's clothing. New forensic techniques enabled the police to retrieve more detailed evidence from the clothes Caroline had worn before her death. DNA traces from the clothes and fibers from the sleep sack were compared to the DNA of possible suspects in the International DNA database. One match, albeit not a perfect one, came from an individual who had been in the vicinity of the truckers' cafe around the same time Caroline was dropped off. However, the match was not enough to make a solid connection between the suspect and the crime. The man had no prior criminal record and denied any involvement in Caroline's death, and without more evidence, the authorities had no choice but to rule him out as the primary suspect. In the years following the reopening of the case, investigators focused on any remaining clues that might point to a potential killer. One of the recurring questions was whether Caroline had been sexually assaulted before her death. While forensic evidence showed signs of physical trauma, including a broken rib and strangulation, it was impossible to confirm or rule out sexual assault due to the condition of the body. The authorities tried to trace back the circumstances of her final hours, hoping to uncover something, anything, that could bring them closer to solving the case. While investigators worked tirelessly on the case, Wil's role remained vital. Her determination to keep Caroline's story alive in the public kept the case from being forgotten. Wil's advocacy not only kept the pressure on authorities, but also made her a symbol of perseverance for other families who had lost loved ones in similar circumstances. One of the most important steps Wil took was speaking out publicly about the failures of the investigation and the difficulties families face when their loved ones are murdered abroad. She emphasized the importance of international cooperation in solving these crimes and stressed the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies across borders. In her letters to politicians and government officials, Wil highlighted the complications that families face when trying to get justice for murders that occur outside their home country. For her, it was not just about finding out what happened to Caroline, but also advocating for change in the way such cases are handled. In 2018, Wil was invited to speak at a national conference on unsolved murders, where she shared her story and discussed the impact of her daughter's case. Her advocacy helped raise awareness about the challenges faced by families like hers, who struggle to get justice when the murder occurs in another country. Despite the setbacks, there were moments when the investigation appeared to make progress. In 2018, the French authorities agreed to release the case file to the Dutch cold case team, a major step in breaking down the barriers between the two countries' investigative forces. This cooperation renewed hope for Wil and for anyone invested in solving Caroline's murder. The Dutch cold case team, with their fresh perspective, revisited the forensic evidence and re-interviewed witnesses. They tracked down individuals who had been in the area of Castet and Rennes in 1996 and worked tirelessly to cross-reference details of Caroline's journey. They also explored new leads, trying to find anyone who might have seen Caroline in the days before her death. However, time was running out, and the case remained cold, with little new information coming to light. Yet, as always, Wil's hope endured. She had been fighting for justice for her daughter for more than 2 decades, and she was determined not to give up until she had the answers she had been searching for. The journey had been long and fraught with obstacles, but Wil's love for her daughter and her unwavering belief in justice kept her going. The murder of Caroline Pino in 1996 shattered not only her life, but also the lives of everyone who loved her. The absence of answers, the years of frustration, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice left an indelible mark on her family, especially her mother, Wil. Wil's story was one of unwavering determination, perseverance, and the hope that, one day, her daughter's killer would be brought to justice. This chapter explores the emotional and psychological toll that the case took on Wil and the entire Pino family, as well as the continued search for answers. In the aftermath of Caroline's death, the grief her family felt was overwhelming. Caroline had always been a bright, creative, and lively young woman, with a unique ability to bring joy to those around her. Her mother, Wil, described her as her big-hearted Pippi Langkous, a free spirit with a thirst for adventure and a deep sense of compassion. Caroline had always been drawn to a life that was not bound by conventions. After the breakdown of her parents' marriage, she had faced considerable challenges, but she had overcome them by finding her own path. The promise of her future had been abruptly taken away, and for her family, the pain was raw and unrelenting. The realization that Caroline had been murdered, the possibility that someone had chosen to end her life in such a brutal and senseless way, was almost too much to bear. Her death was not just a tragic loss, but also an unsolved mystery, a puzzle that haunted Wil and her loved ones for years. The lack of closure made the pain even more unbearable, as every unanswered question only deepened the wound. In the early days of the investigation, there was a sense of hope that justice might be swift. But as time passed, and the case remained unsolved, that hope began to fade. For Wil, the emotional weight of the situation grew heavier each day. Not knowing what had happened to her daughter, not knowing who had committed such a horrific act, meant that the grieving process could never truly begin. Instead, Wil found herself trapped in a limbo of uncertainty, struggling to cope with the emotional burden while trying to keep her resolve intact. Wil's grief was profound, but it was also interwoven with a fierce determination. She was not one to sit idly by. Early on, Wil began writing letters to the police, the Dutch and French governments, and anyone who might be able to help bring justice for Caroline. She was a mother on a mission, her maternal instinct to protect her child still driving her, even in the face of immense sadness. In 1997, just a year after Caroline's murder, Wil took the bold step of writing a letter to the Dutch Minister of Justice. In her letter, she expressed her frustration with the lack of progress in the investigation and urged the government to take action. The response from the minister was dismissive at best. Wil was told that because the crime had occurred in France, there was little that the Dutch government could do to intervene. The case was under French jurisdiction, and they had their own procedures for handling such matters. It was a blow to Wil, who felt powerless in a foreign system that seemed indifferent to her grief. But Wil's resolve only grew stronger. She was not about to let her daughter's case slip through the cracks, no matter how many doors were slammed in her face. She wrote letters to the French authorities, demanded updates on the investigation, and even traveled to France on several occasions to speak directly with the police. She visited the locations connected to Caroline's final days, including the Truckers' Cafe in Castet and the site where Caroline's body had been found in Orsay. Through it all, Wil's goal remained the same: to find out who had killed Caroline and to bring that person to justice. While Wil's fight for justice continued, the emotional toll of the case was increasingly isolating. There was no one who truly understood the weight of her pain, no one who could fully comprehend the agony of a mother who had lost a child in such an horrific way. The feeling of helplessness in the face of such a vast, unfathomable tragedy was overwhelming. Wil often found herself feeling disconnected from the people around her. Friends and family, while supportive, could not fathom the depth of her sorrow. The constant pushback from the authorities, the long years of waiting without answers, only compounded her feelings of isolation. She found solace only in her relentless pursuit of justice. Writing letters, speaking to the media, and campaigning for answers became her way of channeling her grief. It was the only way she knew how to keep moving forward. Despite the isolation, Wil's perseverance caught the attention of the public. Her determination to seek justice for Caroline inspired many who followed the case, especially those who had faced similar tragedies. She became a symbol of strength and resilience, not just for the loss of her daughter, but for the fight against a system that had failed her. Her story was picked up by the media, and in 1997, renowned Dutch crime reporter Peter R. De Vries dedicated several episodes of his show to Caroline's case. These broadcasts brought the case into the public eye once more, but it was not enough to bring a resolution. The emotional toll of Caroline's murder was not limited to Wil alone. Her family, too, struggled to cope with the devastating loss. Caroline's siblings, friends, and extended family members all had their own ways of processing their grief. But for many, the lack of closure made it impossible to heal. Caroline's brother, who had been very close to her, struggled with feelings of anger and frustration. He was unable to understand how anyone could harm his sister, and the years of uncertainty only fueled his resentment. He became disillusioned with the police and the justice system, feeling that Caroline's case had been abandoned. The family's pain was compounded by their helplessness in the face of an investigation that seemed to be going nowhere. For Caroline's friends, the loss was equally profound. They remembered her as a kind-hearted, adventurous spirit who had touched the lives of everyone she met. The fact that she had been taken from them so violently left a gaping hole in their lives, one that could never truly be filled. They, too, wanted answers, wanted to know who had done this to their beloved friend. As the years passed, the emotional burden of the case took its toll on Wil's health. The stress of advocating for justice, of reliving the pain of Caroline's death year after year, began to affect her physically. She experienced bouts of depression and anxiety, and her health began to deteriorate. But even as her body and mind struggled to cope with the weight of it all, Wil remained committed to finding justice for Caroline. In 2017, after years of Wil's persistent lobbying and advocacy, the Dutch cold case team finally made contact with the French authorities. For Wil, this moment marked the beginning of a renewed hope that her daughter's case could finally be solved. The cold case team, with its specialized resources and expertise in handling unsolved cases, began reviewing the evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and looking into any new leads that might have emerged. The involvement of the cold case team gave Wil a renewed sense of purpose. Finally, there was a team of dedicated professionals working to uncover the truth. But even as the team made progress, the emotional strain on Wil continued to grow. Each new development in the case was both a step forward and a reminder of the pain she had lived with for over 2 decades. Every new piece of evidence brought hope, but it also forced her to relive the horrors of her daughter's death. As Wil Pino continued to fight for justice and answers for her daughter Caroline, the passage of time was both her enemy and her motivator. The years of uncertainty and frustration were compounded by the complexities of international law and the intricate processes of cold case investigations. In this part of the chapter, we follow the path Wil took as she pursued every possible avenue, from media campaigns to renewed international cooperation, all while dealing with the personal toll that such an ordeal took on her and her family. After years of limited progress in the investigation, Wil knew that she needed to bring renewed attention to Caroline's case. One of the most significant steps she took was reaching out to the media in an attempt to gain public interest and, hopefully, force law enforcement to revisit the case. The media's ability to influence public opinion and bring pressure on the authorities was something Wil hoped could propel the investigation forward. In 1997, Peter R. De Vries, a famous Dutch crime reporter, took up the cause. His show, Peter R. De Vries, Misdaadreporter, was well known for tackling high-profile cold cases and bringing justice to the forefront. Caroline's case, already 5 years old at the time, became a focal point for De Vries' investigation. Several episodes were dedicated to revisiting the details of Caroline's murder, the circumstances surrounding her last days, and the gaps in the French investigation. The public's interest in the case was reignited, and the media campaign brought Wil some comfort, as she felt that her daughter's death was not being forgotten. But it also reminded her of how little had been done since Caroline's body was discovered in 1996. The media attention, while helpful, also served as a painful reminder of the long road ahead, with no resolution in sight. While the media campaign brought attention to Caroline's case, it did little to overcome the bureaucratic hurdles Wil faced. As a mother desperate for answers, Wil encountered countless frustrations with the lack of cooperation between countries. The French authorities, despite having jurisdiction over the case, had not been able to bring Caroline's killer to justice. And even with the Dutch cold case team on the case, The lack of direct influence over the French investigation created an environment of slow-moving progress. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was the complexity of working across national borders. Investigating a crime that occurred in another country, especially one as complex and sensitive as a murder, required cooperation between multiple agencies, something that often proved to be difficult. The international nature of Caroline's disappearance and murder meant that evidence had to be cross-checked, witnesses had to be tracked down across countries, and foreign legal systems had to be navigated. This resulted in long delays and missed opportunities. And for Wil, every delay felt like a step backward in her pursuit of justice for her daughter. For several years, the case seemed to stagnate, with few updates from the French police and no new leads. The involvement of the cold case team in 2017 brought a sense of renewed hope for Wil, but the investigation would take time, and the slow pace remained a constant source of frustration. As the case became a cold case in the literal sense, the search for new evidence felt like an uphill battle. Wil's relentless pursuit of justice came at a great personal cost. The emotional toll of losing Caroline was devastating enough, but the added pressure of continuously fighting for answers for over 2 decades left Wil mentally and physically exhausted. The constant weight of uncertainty took its toll on her health. She had dealt with depression, anxiety, and a sense of helplessness that only intensified over the years. There were moments when Wil felt that her fight for justice was a Sisyphean task, one that might never end. Her grief over Caroline's loss never lessened, but the constant pressure of the case left Wil struggling to find any sense of peace. Her physical health began to suffer, and the strain of continually having to relive the details of Caroline's murder and the lack of closure was emotionally exhausting. The simple act of hoping for justice became a draining task, one that sapped her energy and sense of self. But even in her darkest moments, Wil found a way to push through. The memories of Caroline, the bond they shared, and the promise to her daughter to never give up kept Wil moving forward. She clung to the belief that her daughter deserved justice, that the killer should be held accountable for the crime. And even though it meant constantly revisiting painful memories, Wil was willing to make that sacrifice for the chance of finding out the truth. In 2017, after years of frustration and the feeling that the case had been abandoned by the authorities, Wil's tireless advocacy finally led to a breakthrough. The cold case team of the Eastern Netherlands took interest in Caroline's case and reached out to the French police. This was a pivotal moment for the investigation. The Dutch cold case team had access to resources and investigative expertise that were not available in the French system. The team's involvement marked a new chapter in the case and brought with it a renewed sense of hope. For Wil, the cold case team's involvement was a bittersweet moment. On the one hand, it represented a chance for new leads and a fresh approach to solving the case. On the other hand, it served as a stark reminder of how many years had been wasted without a significant breakthrough. But despite these mixed emotions, Wil welcomed the opportunity for the case to be reopened with a new perspective. The cold case team carefully reviewed the original evidence from the case, including the items found near Caroline's body, such as her sleeping bag and personal belongings. They contacted old witnesses, re-examined surveillance footage, and dug deeper into any potential leads that had been overlooked in the years prior. This meticulous work led to the identification of several new avenues of inquiry, and Wil once again felt the glimmer of hope that justice might one day be served. As the investigation reopened, Wil found herself caught in a strange limbo between hope and despair. Each new discovery, each new lead, was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought a renewed sense of optimism. Perhaps this time there would be justice for Caroline. But on the other hand, it also dredged up the emotional pain that had been building up for years. The hope that the case would be solved brought with it the fear that it might end in disappointment, as it had so many times before. For Wil, the process of grieving and seeking justice had become inseparable. The search for answers was not just a means to an end, but also a way for her to keep Caroline's memory alive. Each step forward in the investigation, even if it came with its own emotional weight, was a testament to her love for her daughter and her unwavering determination to bring the person responsible to justice. But the emotional cost of hope was immense. As each year passed, and the case continued to hang in the balance, Wil began to question whether she would ever see the closure she so desperately sought. The fear of not getting answers was always present, lurking in the background of her every conversation and every media appearance. The long road to justice for Caroline Pino has been paved with a series of roadblocks, bureaucratic obstacles, unsolved mysteries, and the emotional toll that comes with years of unanswered questions. The years following Caroline's murder have seen a mixture of hope, frustration, and profound sadness, as Wil Pino's determination to find answers remains unyielding, despite the many challenges she faces. By the time 2017 rolled around, Wil had spent more than 2 decades in pursuit of justice for her daughter. The emotional toll of dealing with Caroline's loss and the continuous battle to keep her case alive was unimaginable. What had begun as a mother's grief over the tragic and senseless death of her daughter had turned into an all-consuming mission for justice, one that threatened to overwhelm her, yet also provided her with a sense of purpose. The pain that Wil experienced in the early years after Caroline's murder was deep and persistent, but the never-ending nature of the case exacerbated it. Every time a new lead surfaced or an old lead was revisited, Wil was filled with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that the case might finally come to a resolution, but dread that yet another false lead might cause more disappointment. The constant back and forth between hope and despair was exhausting, and at times Wil questioned whether she could continue pushing for justice. The personal cost of this battle was clear. Wil had already been through the grief of losing Caroline, and now, the ongoing quest for answers was taking its toll on her mental and physical well-being. Sleep became more elusive, and she struggled with the sense of hopelessness that crept in when progress seemed too slow. The emotional strain was compounded by the fact that she was carrying this burden largely on her own. Even though she had the support of friends, family, and the public, the journey to closure remained deeply personal for Wil. Despite these challenges, Wil continued to speak out, write letters, and meet with journalists and officials in an attempt to keep the case alive. She knew that the only way to honor Caroline's memory was to keep fighting, no matter how much it hurt. The frustration of dealing with a stalled investigation and the apparent indifference from some of the authorities never quelled her desire for justice. Instead, it fueled her resolve. One of the most significant challenges in solving Caroline's case has been the bureaucratic web of international law. The fact that the crime took place in France, but Wil and Caroline's family lived in the Netherlands, created a complex situation. Although Caroline was a Dutch citizen, the French authorities had jurisdiction over the investigation, which meant that they controlled much of the information and the pace of the investigation. The international nature of the case meant that the investigation spanned multiple countries: France, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal, each with their own legal systems, investigative practices, and attitudes toward cold cases. This created a level of disjointedness that severely hindered the investigation's progress. The differences in legal systems and the slow-moving nature of international cooperation meant that potential leads in neighboring countries were often not pursued with the same urgency as they might have been within national borders. In addition to the logistical challenges, there was a sense of frustration that Wil and her family felt in trying to get answers. Even though the Dutch authorities were keen to assist in the investigation, they were largely limited in what they could do, because the case was being handled by French law enforcement. The lack of direct access to evidence and the inability to intervene directly in French investigations were consistent points of tension. This web of international bureaucracy became one of the most significant roadblocks to justice. As new evidence was discovered, Wil felt like she was constantly chasing after leads that were delayed or buried in red tape. The slow pace of international cooperation made every development in the case feel like an uphill battle. After years of stagnant progress and mounting frustration, a breakthrough finally came in 2017. The cold case team of the Eastern Netherlands took the case under its wing and contacted the French authorities to request access to the case files. This was a crucial step forward, as it brought renewed attention to the case and provided an opportunity for the Dutch authorities to assist in the investigation. For Wil, this moment was bittersweet. The involvement of the cold case team was a significant step, but it was also a stark reminder of the years that had passed without substantial progress. Still, Wil saw it as an opportunity to press for justice once again. The The cold case team's involvement meant that the case was being taken seriously, and that new efforts would be made to uncover the truth. It was a glimmer of hope in a sea of frustration. The cold case team's approach was methodical and thorough. They reviewed the original evidence from Caroline's case, such as the personal items found near her body, including the sleeping bag she was found in. They re-examined witness testimonies, spoke with French authorities again, and analyzed old leads that had been left unexplored. It was a painstaking process that required a fresh look at everything that had been done before, but it also brought with it the possibility of new insights. For Wil, the involvement of the cold case team brought a renewed sense of hope. But even as she allowed herself to believe that progress could finally be made, she remained cautious. The road ahead was still long, and the emotional cost of continuing to hope for closure was never far from her mind. As the case reopened, Wil found herself caught in a cycle of hope and disappointment. Each new development, whether it was the involvement of the cold case team, the discovery of new evidence, or the possibility of tracking down new witnesses, brought a brief moment of excitement. Yet every setback, every delay, and every dead end also served as a painful reminder that justice was still elusive. Wil continued to hold on to the belief that Caroline's killer would one day be brought to justice. But the emotional toll of constantly revisiting the tragedy was immense. There were times when Wil felt as though she was trapped in an emotional cycle that she couldn't break free from, one where the highs of new developments were always followed by the crushing lows of unresolved questions. Yet, despite these emotional swings, Wil found the strength to continue. She knew that her daughter's case had to be pursued to the very end, no matter how many years it took. For Wil, the fight for justice was more than just about solving a crime. It was about keeping Caroline's memory alive and ensuring that her daughter's death was not forgotten. As Chapter 6 continues, Wil's journey of perseverance, strength, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds unfolds further. The international investigation, the constant emotional strain, and the bureaucratic challenges that stand in the way are all part of the ongoing fight for justice for Caroline Pino. As Wil Pino continued her quest for justice for her daughter, the road was still full of setbacks, frustrations, and painful moments. The fight was not just about uncovering the truth about what happened to Caroline. It was about seeking closure, about finding a sense of peace that had been absent for over 2 decades. But with each passing year, the weight of the search grew heavier. Wil's resolve to keep fighting, though, never wavered. It was this unyielding determination that allowed her to press forward, despite the many challenges that lay ahead. In the modern age, social media and the internet have become essential tools for raising awareness and seeking justice. For Wil, the growing presence of social media meant that the case could no longer be ignored. It allowed her to connect with others who cared about Caroline's story, and more importantly, it kept the pressure on authorities to take action. Through social media platforms, Wil was able to share Caroline's story far beyond the borders of France and the Netherlands. She found support from people across the globe who were willing to help raise awareness, share information, and even offer new leads. In many ways, social media became an amplifier for her voice, a way for her to keep the case alive and prevent it from slipping into obscurity. In 2017, when the Dutch cold case team got involved and reached out to the French authorities, Wil's efforts to publicize the case helped generate renewed interest in the investigation. The story of Caroline's death began to resurface in the media, and with it, new pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. As more and more people heard about Caroline's case, it brought fresh attention to her tragic end, with the hope that new leads might emerge. The involvement of journalists and investigative reporters in the case proved invaluable. In particular, a special segment on the case featured on the Dutch news raised the profile of the investigation significantly. With the spotlight back on Caroline's death, there was a renewed sense of urgency to solve the case. For Wil, the support from the public was both humbling and heartening. The sense of community that emerged around Caroline's case was a reminder that her daughter's story had not been forgotten. Yet, it also brought a new level of pressure, as people who followed the case became emotionally invested in the outcome. They were eagerly awaiting answers, just as Wil was. The burden of this public attention could sometimes feel overwhelming. Every time a new article or story was published, it brought the case back into the spotlight. While this could be a positive thing, it also meant that Wil was constantly reliving the trauma of her daughter's death. The emotional toll of the fight for justice was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a way to keep Caroline's memory alive, but on the other, it was a painful reminder of the gaping hole left in Wil's life. As Wil pressed on with her campaign for justice, she also faced significant legal and political challenges. In particular, the lack of international cooperation between the various countries involved in Caroline's case created substantial hurdles. Although the Dutch authorities had made efforts to support the French investigation, the lack of direct jurisdiction over the case in France meant that they were often limited in their actions. In addition, there was the issue of the legal complexities surrounding cold cases. Because the investigation in France had become stalled for years, many of the leads from the early stages of the investigation had gone cold. By the time the Dutch cold case team became involved in 2017, several pieces of evidence were no longer fresh or accessible, and the chances of finding concrete leads were significantly reduced. As the case continued, the threat of legal statutes of limitations loomed large, further complicating matters. Wil had hoped that by writing letters to politicians, both in the Netherlands and abroad, she could push for the case to be treated with the urgency it deserved. But the responses she received were often frustratingly tepid. In 1997, a letter from the Dutch minister had promised that the Netherlands would do what it could to assist in the case, but it became clear that the Dutch authorities had little power over the French investigation. The promise of support was far from a guarantee of action. Over the years, Wil's letters became a mix of impassioned pleas and weary frustration. In one of her most poignant letters, written in 2000, she implored the political establishment to understand that the lack of closure for Caroline's death was not just a legal issue. It was a deeply personal tragedy that had devastated her family. However, despite her persistence, the political and legal systems often seemed indifferent to her cause. In 2017, when the cold case team became involved, Wil felt a brief moment of hope. But even as Dutch investigators began to review the case and seek further cooperation from French authorities, the lack of decisive action from the French government was discouraging. The complicated nature of international investigations continued to slow progress, and with every passing year, the likelihood of solving the case seemed to diminish. One of the most important allies in Wil's fight for justice was the media. Journalists, reporters, and television programs, including those like Peter R. de Vries' investigative program, gave a platform to Caroline's story. The exposure not only brought attention to the case, but also made it clear that this was a case that needed solving. In the late 1990s, Peter R. de Vries, a prominent Dutch journalist and crime investigator, devoted multiple episodes of his television program to Caroline's case. The program's in-depth coverage not only shed light on the lack of progress in the investigation, but also reignited public interest. As a result, new witnesses came forward and old leads were revisited. This exposure was instrumental in keeping the case in the public eye and maintaining pressure on the authorities to take action. Wil's efforts, combined with the media's coverage, ensured that Caroline's death was not forgotten. But, as she had come to understand, even the most well-publicized cases were no guarantee of justice. The process of securing a conviction, particularly in cases as complex as Caroline's, was slow and fraught with obstacles. Still, for Wil, the media was an essential tool in her pursuit of answers. The more people knew about Caroline's death, the more likely it was that someone would come forward with information. The fight for justice was not just Wil's personal struggle, it had become a collective effort. As the years dragged on and the case remained unsolved, the strain on Wil's personal life became evident. Wil had dedicated so much of her time and energy to the pursuit of justice for Caroline that it began to affect her relationships and overall well-being. Her marriage, which had already suffered due to the emotional toll of Caroline's death, became increasingly strained. Her husband, though supportive of her efforts, often struggled with the weight of their shared grief. The relentless pursuit of justice took a toll on their family life and forced them to grapple with painful realities. Wil's relationship with her other children was also affected by her singular focus on Caroline's case. Her children were incredibly supportive of their mother, but they also struggled with the fact that Wil's grief and pursuit of justice often consumed her. leaving little room for the lighter moments of family life. Wil had always been close to her children, but the years of fighting for justice had created an emotional distance that was difficult to bridge. At the same time, Wil was determined not to let Caroline's story be lost in the shuffle. The emotional strain of the case was undeniable, but Wil believed that the fight for justice was her way of honoring her daughter. As painful as it was, she could not let the case slip into obscurity. The emotional and physical toll on her body and mind was immense, but her love for Caroline and her desire to seek justice pushed her forward. As the years passed, Wil's fight for justice for Caroline entered a new phase, one that was defined by both frustration and reluctant acceptance. The search for answers had been long and grueling, with numerous dead ends, bureaucratic hurdles, and legal entanglements. But the most challenging part of Wil's journey was learning to live with the uncertainty. For a mother who had already endured the unimaginable pain of losing her daughter in such a violent, unresolved way, this uncertainty was another deep wound. It was a painful realization that the answers she so desperately sought might never come. Cold cases, by their very nature, are complicated. Investigations that start with a flurry of activity eventually become bogged down by the passage of time. Evidence becomes harder to analyze, witnesses forget key details, and the people who might have known something are no longer reachable. For Wil, this truth was a constant companion. In Caroline's case, the investigative process had been disjointed from the start. The French police, who had initially handled the investigation, made several errors that set the case back. The delay in identifying Caroline's body and the lack of cooperation between France, Spain, and the Netherlands meant that crucial evidence was either mishandled or never fully explored. Even as the Dutch cold case team reopened the investigation in 2017, they faced the same challenges that had plagued the case from the beginning. The most difficult realization for Wil was that time had become her greatest enemy. With each passing year, the chances of finding definitive evidence decreased. Though advances in DNA testing and forensic science had allowed for some new avenues of exploration, the core issues of the case remained unresolved. The person or people responsible for Caroline's death might never be brought to justice, and that thought weighed heavily on Wil's heart. Wil had always been a woman of great strength, but the years of fighting for justice had taken a heavy emotional toll. She had spent decades pursuing leads, writing letters, meeting with investigators, and constantly reliving the pain of her daughter's death. There were moments when Wil questioned whether it was worth it, whether the emotional and physical exhaustion had become too much to bear. In her darkest moments, she wondered if continuing the fight would ever bring her peace. It was difficult to keep going when the results were always just out of reach. The lack of closure was a constant source of pain for Wil. She had imagined a day when the killer would finally be caught, when justice would be served, and she would have some semblance of peace. But as the years passed, she realized that this outcome was not guaranteed. The search for justice had become an all-consuming part of her life, and without answers, it was hard to see how she could ever heal. At the same time, there were small moments of hope that kept Wil going. She would meet with journalists or investigators who were still passionate about the case, and they would assure her that they were not giving up. These moments reminded her that Caroline's story had not been forgotten, and there were still people out there working to find the truth. But hope was a fragile thing, often tempered by the stark reality that justice might never be fully realized. Over the years, Wil had been forced to confront the painful possibility that she might never receive the closure she so desperately sought. There was a point when she accepted that the person or people responsible for Caroline's death might never be caught. The lack of concrete leads, combined with the passage of time, made the task of solving the case seem nearly impossible. But even with this acceptance, the pain of not knowing the truth about Caroline's final moments never subsided. In some ways, this acceptance was a form of surrender, a way for Wil to reconcile with the harsh reality that no matter how hard she fought, she might never have all the answers. However, it was also a form of empowerment. By accepting the uncertainty, Wil began to free herself from the weight of constantly searching for something that may never materialize. She had given her all to the fight for justice, and now, she was learning to find peace within herself, even if that peace did not come in the form of a resolution. Yet, Wil's journey was not just about finding closure for herself. It was about making sure that Caroline's story was never forgotten. She wanted the world to know that her daughter's life mattered and that her death deserved justice. Even if the case remained unsolved, Wil would continue to tell Caroline's story, to share her daughter's memory with anyone who would listen. Through the pain, Wil found a sense of purpose. She had spent years chasing justice for Caroline, but in the end, it became clear that her mission was not only about the search for answers. It was also about keeping Caroline's legacy alive, ensuring that her life and her death were not reduced to a forgotten statistic. Caroline was more than just a cold case. She was a young woman with hopes, dreams, and a future that was cruelly cut short. By continuing to tell her story, Wil made sure that Caroline would never be forgotten. As the years wore on, Wil's life began to take on a new rhythm. The intensity of the search for justice began to diminish, not because she had given up, but because she had come to understand that some things were beyond her control. She began to focus more on the aspects of her life that had been neglected during her years of relentless pursuit. Her relationship with her surviving children, who had supported her throughout the years, grew stronger. The grief that had once overshadowed everything was still there, but Wil was learning to navigate it in a healthier way. She spent more time with her family, focusing on the moments of joy and love that had always been there, even in the darkest times. In her quieter moments, Wil would reflect on Caroline's life and death, but she was no longer consumed by the need for answers. Instead, she focused on the love she had for her daughter, the memories of Caroline's creativity, humor, and determination. In some ways, this was the closure Wil had been seeking all along. It wasn't a resolution to the case, but it was a sense of peace that came from within herself. The fight for justice for Caroline had been an all-consuming battle, but Wil realized that it was not the only part of her life that mattered. In the end, it was the love she had for her daughter and the memories of their time together that would sustain her, even in the absence of answers. She was left with a bittersweet understanding of the nature of her struggle. While she might never find the answers she had spent so many years searching for, the love she had for Caroline would always remain her guiding light. It was the one thing that no one could take from her. In the end, Wil's fight for justice was not just about finding the truth. It was about honoring Caroline's life and making sure that her memory would never fade. Even without closure, Wil's love for her daughter would continue to shine brightly, a beacon in the darkness that would guide her for the rest of her life. Caroline Pino's story is far from over. While the search for justice may not have provided the resolution Wil hoped for, the love between a mother and her daughter is a bond that death cannot sever. And in that love, Caroline's legacy will live on forever.